Picture this: a city of marble glowing under torchlight, a palace that has seen 100 triumphs and twice as many betrayals. You climb the polished steps with a golden invitation in your hand, your name etched beside the emperor's seal. This should be the peak of a Roman life. The purple stripe on your toga, the nods of respect, the promise of favor. Yet the closer you get to the doors of the Palatine, the heavier the air becomes. The guards won't meet your eyes. The scent of incense hangs sweet and suffocating, like a prayer that knows it won't be answered. Inside, conversation dies in the throat. Senators, generals, merchants, men who command legions, stand still as statues. Then comes the sound you'll remember for the rest of your days. The echo of measured footsteps, a low laugh that doesn't belong in a sacred hall. Caligula enters, not as a ruler, but as a storm wearing a human face. His gaze moves across the room the way a blade tests a thumb. He smiles as if he's discovered a private joke, and somehow you realize you're the punchline. Tonight, you're not here to be honored. You're here to be measured, not by your victories, but by your fear, by how quickly you will bend, how neatly you will break. Because this is not about pleasure, or spectacle, or even cruelty for its own sake. This is about power unchained, testing the limits of every oath Rome ever swore. If you want to understand how an empire can be conquered from within, start here. On a night when marble remembers footsteps, and the strongest men in the world learn what it means to be helpless. The city of Rome never truly slept. Even long after sunset, the air shimmered with the echoes of power, chariots rumbling across cobbled streets, torches flickering against the marble faces of forgotten gods. On this night, the Palatine Hill glowed like the heart of a living beast. Columns gleamed gold and ivory under the torchlight, and from somewhere deep within the imperial palace, a faint melody drifted through the corridors, a slow, haunting tune played on a lyre. You climb the staircase slowly, each step heavier than the last. The letter in your hand trembles. Its golden seal bears the imperial crest, the eagle, the laurel wreath, and the initials CCAG, Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. To the world, he is Emperor Caligula, Lord of Rome. To you, tonight, he feels like fate itself. The guards at the entrance straighten as you approach. Their armor gleams in the torchlight, but their faces are carved from stone. One of them glances at the invitation in your hand, then steps aside without a word. The silence feels wrong. In Rome, silence is never neutral. It's either respect or fear, and you already know which one this is. Inside, the great hall of the Palatine stretches before you, vast enough to swallow sound. The marble floor shines like water. Dozens of figures stand scattered across the room, senators in their formal robes, wealthy merchants dripping in gold, generals polished like statues of Mars. These are the men who rule the world, and yet none of them dare to speak. Their wives stand beside them, pale and rigid, hands clasped in front of jeweled gowns. A few exchange nervous glances. Others stare at the floor as if afraid the walls themselves might be listening. The scent of incense burns thick in the air, sweet and heavy, meant to purify, but instead, it smothers. Beneath it, you smell something else. The metallic tang of sweat, of fear. Then, without warning, the sound that will live in your bones forever, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the marble corridor. A laugh follows, soft at first, almost playful. But it grows louder, more manic, until it fills the chamber like thunder wrapped in silk. And then you see him. Caligula enters not as a man, but as a vision. His robe shimmers gold in the light, so thin it moves like liquid around his body. A crown of delicate laurel leaves gleams on his head, but his eyes are brighter than any jewel in the room. There's a light in them that's hard to name, somewhere between brilliance and madness. He walks with the ease of someone who knows he owns the air everyone else must breathe. When he reaches the center of the room, the music dies. He doesn't speak right away. Instead, he lets the silence grow, stretching it like a taut rope. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he claps his hands together, the sound ricocheting off the marble walls. "My dear friends," he says, his voice rich and melodic, every syllable dripping with charm. "What a joy to see you all tonight. Rome's finest, gathered beneath my roof. I could not dream of better company." A murmur ripples through the crowd, half greeting, half-forced relief. You bow slightly, as do the others. Caligula's smile widens, but there's something off about it, as if the gesture itself is a kind of test. Tonight, he continues, pacing slowly, his robe whispering against the floor. We celebrate loyalty, devotion, love for our emperor. The word love hangs in the air too long. His tone shifts, not angry, not yet, but curious, dangerous. Yes, love. Such a fragile thing, isn't it? Easy to claim, harder to prove. He stops walking. His gaze sweeps the room, pauses, lingers, pierces. When his eyes lock with yours, your chest tightens. For a heartbeat, you forget to breathe. Then he smiles again, and it's worse than if he'd scowled. We shall see tonight, he says softly, almost tenderly, who among Rome's greatest truly loves their emperor. There's no applause, no laughter, just the faint rustle of silk and the pounding of your own pulse. Caligula turns toward a long banquet table gleaming under candlelight. The dishes are arranged like offerings, roasted pheasants glazed in honey, figs stuffed with almonds, goblets of dark red wine. Yet no one moves. The food is a stage prop. The feast, a trap dressed as celebration. He gestures lazily. Eat, he says. Drink. Enjoy yourselves. No one does. Caligula laughs again, and the sound cracks like glass. Ah, the burden of dignity, he says, shaking his head. You Romans pretend to fear the gods, but you only fear each other. Allow me, then, to free you from that burden. He lifts a cup of wine, raises it high. To Rome, he declares. The crowd echoes weakly. To Rome. You lift your cup too, but your hand trembles. The wine catches the light, dark, viscous, like blood. As the night unfolds, time loses meaning. Musicians play soft melodies, but their faces are drained of joy. The emperor moves among the guests, asking questions that sound like jokes, but carry the weight of commands. Senator Lucius, he says with a grin. You've been married, what, 15 years? Tell me, does your wife still look at you with love? The senator stammers. The room holds its breath. Caligula laughs, throws an arm around the man's shoulders, kisses his cheek like a brother. I jest. You Romans have no sense of humor. But the joke lingers, sharp as a knife's edge. At one point, you catch sight of the emperor's reflection in the polished marble floor. For a moment, he doesn't look human, just light and shadow tangled together. You think of the stories whispered about him. The child who saw his family destroyed, the youth who learned that survival meant smiling through horror. And you realize, maybe this is what happens when fear becomes the only language a man knows. Outside, thunder rolls over the city. Inside, Caligula raises his arms, and the hall grows quiet once more. Do you feel it? He whispers. The gods are watching. They wish to see who among us is worthy. You glance toward the open doors of the palace, where the night wind carries the faint sound of the Tiber flowing far below. For a brief, foolish moment, you imagine running down the steps, through the torchlight, into the dark freedom of the streets. But then Caligula's eyes find you again, and your body freezes. This is no longer Rome as you knew it. This is a theater, and everyone in it plays a part written by one man's madness. You set your cup down slowly, hoping not to draw attention. But Caligula smiles, as if reading your thoughts. Yes, he says softly, stepping closer. You understand. Tonight is not about joy. It's about truth. And truth, my friends, is rarely kind. He turns toward the crowd, his voice rising with theatrical warmth. Let us begin. The musicians strike a trembling chord. Servants scurry to light more torches. The shadows deepen, stretching long across the marble. You feel the world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath the Palatine itself has decided to join the emperor's madness. And in that instant, as Caligula's laughter fills the hall again, rich, manic, echoing, you know this night will not be remembered for its wine or its music. It will be remembered as the moment when Rome, the greatest empire on earth, looked into the eyes of its ruler and saw the beginning of its own corruption. The marble glows. The torches hiss. The laughter lingers. The empire holds its breath. Long before the madness, before the gold and marble and whispered fear, there was a little boy who marched beside an army. He was no taller than the soldiers' shields, yet he wore his own tiny boots and armor made by the legion's blacksmiths, scaled down for a child who belonged to Rome's most beloved general. The men adored him. When he toddled through the camp, they'd shout, "Caligula, Little Boots," a nickname that stuck to him like a prophecy. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the son of Germanicus, hero of the legions, the man who could have been emperor himself if fate had been kind. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was strong, brilliant, and fiercely loyal to Rome. From the outside, theirs was the perfect imperial family, glory, honor, bloodline, and divine favor. But behind the triumphs and parades, the imperial household was a nest of daggers. The boy learned early that love and loyalty could turn to poison overnight. When he was 6, his father fell mysteriously ill while commanding in the east. The rumor spread like wildfire. The sickness was no accident. Emperor Tiberius, jealous of Germanicus's popularity, had ordered the poisoning. Caligula watched the light fade from his father's eyes, saw the soldiers weep, and felt the first crack in the illusion of safety. At his father's funeral, the streets of Rome overflowed with mourners. The boy walked beside the coffin, wearing miniature armor, tears streaking down his cheeks. The people cheered his name, Little Boots, the son of Germanicus, as if their love could protect him. But in Rome, love was a dangerous currency. It made you valuable, and it made you a target. Soon after, everything collapsed. His mother Agrippina spoke too boldly, too publicly, accusing Tiberius of treachery. One by one, her allies disappeared. The family was dismantled methodically, like a building being stripped of its supports. Caligula's brothers were exiled to remote islands. His mother followed soon after. Letters stopped arriving. Names were erased from public records. The boy was spared, but not by kindness. Tiberius saw potential in him, or perhaps a reflection of his own youth twisted by paranoia. Caligula was brought to the emperor's villa at Capri, a place whispered about even in the darkest corners of Rome. There, amid luxury and dread, he learned the true language of power. Capri was a paradise with the heart of a prison. The cliffs were white and steep, the sea below impossibly blue, yet the air was heavy with secrets. Tiberius lived surrounded by guards and spies, convinced that death lurked behind every curtain. He trusted no one, loved no one, and punished everyone who reminded him of the son he had lost, or the heir he feared. For years, Caligula walked those halls on silent feet, smiling when spoken to, laughing when required. He learned that survival meant imitation. He mirrored Tiberius's gestures, his humor, even his silences. The old emperor seemed to enjoy the boy's company, at least as much as a man poisoned by suspicion could enjoy anything. But every moment was a test. One wrong word, one flicker of emotion, and he could vanish like the rest of his family. So he hid behind charm. Behind those bright eyes, he memorized the lessons that would shape the rest of his life. Never trust affection. Never show weakness. And when the moment comes, strike before they strike you. As he grew older, Caligula began to understand the machinery of imperial fear. He watched senators grovel, generals flatter, and slaves disappear. He saw how Tiberius turned guilt into governance, how the mere accusation of disloyalty could destroy a man. Power, Caligula realized, wasn't about armies or gold. It was about control, the ability to make others live or die with a word. Sometimes, when Tiberius was in one of his black moods, he would summon the young Gaius to sit beside him. The emperor would stare out over the sea, the waves flashing like blades in the sunlight. "Do you see it, boy?" he'd whisper. "All of this, all of Rome, built on obedience. Break that, and everything falls apart." Caligula would nod solemnly, pretending not to feel the chill crawling up his spine. When he was 15, news reached Capri. His last surviving brother had died in exile. The messenger spoke softly, but the words echoed through the villa like thunder. That night, Caligula sat alone by a fountain, staring at the water until dawn. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. Something inside him simply went quiet. Years later, historians would argue about whether the boy who left Capri was already mad. But madness implies chaos, and there was nothing chaotic about Caligula. His transformation was slow, methodical, a seed planted in terror and watered with silence. In 37 CE, when Tiberius finally died, Caligula was 24. The old man's body was scarcely cold before the news reached Rome. Gaius Caesar, son of Germanicus, is emperor. The city erupted in joy. After decades of fear, they believed deliverance had come at last. The people poured into the streets, throwing flowers, burning incense, shouting his name. For the first time, Caligula smiled without pretending. The boy who had once watched his family destroyed now stood atop the empire that had broken them. He addressed the Senate with humility, promised to restore honor and justice, swore that the horrors of Tiberius's rule would never return. And for a brief, golden moment, he kept his word. He freed political prisoners. He recalled exiles. He gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. Gladiatorial games returned to the Colosseum, bright and extravagant. He visited the people in disguise, tossing coins into the crowd, laughing like a man reborn. The Romans adored him. He was young, handsome, and, above all, he was Germanicus's son. But power, once tasted, never sleeps. The applause that once comforted him began to sound hollow. The flattery he'd learned to mimic on Capri now surrounded him, and he recognized every false note. The courtiers smiled too easily, the senators bowed too deeply. Even the guard's loyalty felt conditional, purchased, not earned. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the lessons of Capri whispered, "They love you now." But love dies. Fear endures. Then came the sickness. Late that same year, Caligula fell violently ill. Ancient writers called it a brain fever. For days, he drifted between life and death, the empire holding its breath. When he finally awoke, he was weak but alive, and something inside him had changed. He stared at his reflection and did not recognize the eyes that looked back. He laughed when no one spoke, and when courtiers wept with relief, he asked them why they were still alive. The illness had stripped away what little restraint survived Capri. What emerged was not the golden boy Rome adored, but the child who had learned long ago that compassion was a liability. He began to test people, small at first, harmless gestures. An unexpected question, a strange order, a cruel joke disguised as wit. Each time, no one dared to object. And each time, he pushed further. By the time the Senate realized what was happening, it was too late. The emperor had discovered the same truth Tiberius once whispered to him. Obedience is stronger than love. But unlike his mentor, Caligula no longer sought obedience through fear alone. He wanted proof. He wanted spectacle. He wanted to look into the eyes of Rome's greatest men and see their souls break. The child in the shadows had finally stepped into the light, and the empire would never be the same again. When Caligula ascended the throne in 37 CE, Rome erupted with euphoria. Bells rang from the temples, incense burned in the streets, and garlands hung from the columns of the Forum. For the first time in decades, the city dared to celebrate. The reign of Tiberius, the old recluse who ruled by fear and rumor, was over. Now the empire had a new master, young, charming, and full of promise, Gaius Caesar, son of the beloved Germanicus. To the people, Caligula wasn't just another emperor. He was redemption itself, the living symbol of everything Rome had lost under Tiberius. They remembered his father's bravery, his mother's honor, and his family's suffering. When Caligula addressed the Senate for the first time, his words were clear, measured, almost humble. Rome has endured enough suspicion and silence. I intend to restore the light. And for a while, it seemed he meant it. He ordered the release of political prisoners. Exiles returned home, stepping off ships with tears in their eyes. Senators once accused of treason were welcomed back into public life. The names that Tiberius had erased were restored to the records. Monuments were rebuilt. The air in Rome seemed lighter, almost joyful. The young emperor opened the imperial treasury and distributed money to soldiers, citizens, and even the poor. "Let Rome remember generosity," he said, smiling before the crowd. He arranged massive feasts open to the public, where the streets glowed with lanterns and fountains poured not water but wine. He re-established games in the Circus Maximus, thundering chariots, gladiatorial contests, plays honoring the gods. When he appeared in the imperial box, the crowd roared so loudly that the announcers had to pause. Every movement of his hand, every word he spoke, became legend. For a brief, golden season, Caligula was everything Rome wanted him to be. Even the Senate, usually cautious, felt a cautious optimism. The young emperor showed them respect, greeting the oldest senators by name, listening attentively during meetings. He even ordered that the records of Tiberius's secret trials be destroyed, promising that no Roman citizen would again live under the shadow of constant accusation. At night, the emperor would visit the temples alone. He was often seen kneeling before the statue of Jupiter, murmuring prayers for guidance. "He's pious," the people whispered. "He's different." The poets praised him. The people adored him. Rome, weary from fear, let itself believe again. But somewhere behind that bright smile, the shadows of Capri still whispered. He remembered too clearly the villa on the cliffs, the nights filled with silent dread. He had learned there that affection was a trap, that praise could turn to poison in a heartbeat. So while he accepted the people's love, he didn't trust it. He studied it, like a scholar observing a dangerous animal. He started testing those around him in small ways. When a senator praised him too eagerly, Caligula would pause, smile faintly, and ask, "Do you praise me because you believe it, or because you fear the silence that follows if you don't?" The senator would stammer, pale, unsure whether to laugh or kneel. Caligula would let the silence stretch, then laugh himself, clapping the man on the shoulder. "I jest," he'd say, but his eyes never matched his smile. Still, most dismissed his eccentricities. He was young, energetic, unpredictable, perhaps too theatrical, but Rome had known worse. When he announced an ambitious public project, a new aqueduct system and the restoration of temples neglected under Tiberius, the city rejoiced again. He attended races, awarded prizes, spoke to soldiers in their camps. "Our emperor is one of us," they said. Then came the illness. Late that autumn, Caligula collapsed during a Senate meeting. Witnesses said his eyes rolled back and his body convulsed before he was carried out of the chamber. For weeks, the palace was sealed. Rumors swirled: poisoning, divine punishment, plague. The empire held its breath. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, lighting candles, praying for his recovery. Mothers held their children up toward the sky, begging the gods to spare the good emperor. Senators wept openly in the forum. The young ruler who had given Rome hope now hovered between life and death. Then, after nearly a month, the palace doors opened. Caligula appeared on the balcony, pale but alive. The crowd below exploded in cheers. People knelt in the streets, thanking the gods. The emperor raised a trembling hand, smiling faintly. "Rome," he said softly, "your prayers have saved me." But those who knew him best saw something different in his eyes. The warmth was gone. The light had hardened into something sharp and unrecognizable. The Senate declared a public festival to celebrate his recovery. Caligula agreed, but he didn't attend the games. Instead, he spent the day alone in the palace, walking the halls for hours, whispering to himself. That night, servants overheard him laughing, softly at first, then uncontrollably. When he reappeared the next morning, everything changed. He ordered new portraits of himself, larger, more divine. He had coins struck with his face radiating sunbeams, the inscription calling him not just princeps, first citizen, but Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He summoned senators one by one and asked them what they would sacrifice to prove their loyalty. Some answered with words, others with tears. None dared to question him. At the next Senate session, he delivered a speech that chilled the chamber. "While I slept," he said, "I visited the gods. I stood among them. I saw what they see." He paused, scanning the room. "Now I return to rule not as man, but as what the gods have made me." No one spoke. No one moved. He dismissed half the Senate that day. Those who tried to leave Rome found their estates confiscated. Palace staff whispered that the emperor now spoke to statues, asking Jupiter's likeness for advice, laughing with the marble as though it answered. The man who had once freed prisoners now ordered new arrests. The man who had once prayed for Rome's light now drew the curtains closed. When his sister Drusilla died unexpectedly, Caligula's grief became another form of obsession. He declared her a goddess, demanding temples built in her honor. Priests were ordered to offer sacrifices in her name, and he referred to her as my divine companion. The Senate, terrified, complied. The streets that had once celebrated him now fell quiet after dark. People spoke his name in whispers again, the way they had under Tiberius. But this time, the fear felt different. It wasn't the fear of suspicion, it was the fear of madness. Caligula had crossed an invisible threshold. The boy who had survived through silence was now the man who ruled through noise. laughter, shouting, commands, decrees. He filled the empire with the sound of his power, so he wouldn't have to hear the echoes of his past. In less than 7 months, Rome's savior had become its storm. And while the people still cheered in public, they began to avoid looking at the palace at night, afraid of what the gods, or whatever now lived inside that gilded building, might see looking back. The golden season had ended. The torches still burned, but their light no longer warmed. Rome, once again, had learned that even the brightest dawn can conceal the darkest shadow. The change began with a fever. No lightning bolt, no visible curse of the gods, just a sickness that started like a whisper and ended like a prophecy. In late autumn of 37 CE, only a few months after the entire empire had cheered his name, Emperor Caligula collapsed. Witnesses said his skin burned to the touch, his body shaking violently, as if struck by divine wrath. The Senate sent offerings to the temples. Mothers knelt in the streets, praying for the young ruler who had promised them freedom from fear. For days, Rome stopped breathing. The markets fell silent. The races were canceled. The Praetorian Guard stood tense at the gates of the Palatine Palace, their armor reflecting the light of hundreds of candles lit for the emperor's health. And then, the doors of the palace closed. What happened inside those marble walls remains one of history's great mysteries. Some claimed Caligula was poisoned by jealous nobles. Others said the gods themselves had touched his mind. But what emerged from that room weeks later was not the man Rome remembered. When Caligula reappeared, his body was thinner, his skin pale, but it was his eyes that unsettled everyone. Once warm and vibrant, they now glimmered with something wild, something that didn't quite belong to this world. He greeted the people from his balcony, smiling as the crowd screamed with joy. He thanked them for their prayers, blessed their loyalty, and promised that Rome's glory would reach beyond the stars. The people wept. They thought the gods had spared their beloved emperor. They were wrong. That same night, Caligula summoned his advisors. The meeting began as usual, with courtesies, with laughter, but as the evening wore on, his tone shifted. While I lay between life and death, he said, I saw the faces of the gods. They spoke to me. They told me I was not one of you. The room fell silent. Do you know what it's like, he continued softly, to hear Jupiter's voice in your dreams? To see Apollo's light in your own reflection? I am not merely emperor. I am divine. The men bowed their heads, unsure whether to agree or tremble. The emperor's illness had left more than scars. It had stripped away the thin layer of humanity that once held him to reason. From that day forward, the transformation quickened. He began demanding worship, not respect. Statues of the gods were altered to bear his face. He ordered temples rededicated in his name. Gold coins were minted with the inscription, Caligula, Lord and God. At first, people thought it was symbolic, a gesture, a youthful eccentricity. Rome had seen divine emperors before, but this was different. He no longer prayed to Jupiter. He spoke to him. He held conversations with the god statue, sometimes shouting, sometimes laughing. One night, he stood before the temple altar, staring at the marble face of Jupiter and said, Move aside. There cannot be two kings of heaven. Priests stood frozen, too terrified to intervene. By day, he acted with feverish energy, signing decrees, holding feasts, organizing grand spectacles. By night, his mind drifted into the shadows. Servants whispered that he wandered the corridors of the palace alone, murmuring to invisible companions. Sometimes they heard him weeping, sometimes laughing, sometimes both. He began to distrust everyone. The senators who once praised him now avoided his gaze, afraid that even flattery might sound like mockery. A general who arrived late to a meeting was accused of conspiracy and executed. A merchant who failed to bow deeply enough was stripped of property. Even the Praetorian Guard, who had sworn eternal loyalty, found themselves on edge, unsure which of their number would vanish next. Then came the public games. What began as entertainment slowly turned into theater of control. He organized elaborate ceremonies to celebrate his recovery. But instead of honoring the gods, they honored him. The first such event was held in the Forum, under blazing sunlight. Thousands gathered as Caligula appeared dressed in gleaming white robes, a crown of rays upon his head. He stood before the crowd, arms outstretched. Behold, he shouted, your living God. The roar that followed wasn't applause, it was survival. Every voice shouted out of fear, not faith. Every cheer masked a heartbeat of dread. The emperor smiled, satisfied. And that's when the cruelty began to take shape. Not the chaos of a madman, but the careful experimentation of a man who had learned that power could replace love. He tested the boundaries of obedience like a scientist testing the limits of human pain. He ordered senators to dance, dressed in women's clothing, to amuse him at dinner. He made generals crawl across the floor to kiss his feet. He called for nobles' wives to dine beside him, only to mock their husbands with veiled threats. Each humiliation was recorded not for pleasure, but for proof. Proof that no one in Rome, no bloodline, no title, no oath, could resist his will. The fever had burned away the last traces of the young emperor who once spoke of mercy and renewal. What stood now was a man who no longer saw a difference between reverence and terror. In private, he began constructing a new kind of empire, one built not on marble and law, but on fear and spectacle. He had special chambers built within the palace, rooms lined with polished bronze mirrors where he would practice speeches, gestures, smiles. He told his architects, "When Rome sees me, they must see the sun." Even his closest attendants began to sense the danger. Those who had once guided him now found themselves dismissed, or worse, silenced. His court filled instead with flatterers, performers, and sycophants willing to feed the emperor's growing delusion of godhood. As months passed, Caligula's paranoia turned outward. He began to suspect that the gods themselves were jealous. He mocked Jupiter in public, demanded that Neptune surrender the sea to him, and even ordered the construction of a bridge across the Bay of Baiae so he could walk upon the waters. When senators questioned the cost, he replied, "Can one put a price on divinity?" The project consumed thousands of lives and millions of coins, but when it was finished, Caligula rode across it in golden armor, shouting to the horizon, "See, Rome. The sea obeys me." The crowd cheered. What else could they do? From the heights of the Palatine, the empire seemed unchanged. Armies still marched, taxes still flowed, temples still glowed in the sun. But inside the marble heart of Rome, something essential had broken. The man who once promised to free Rome from fear had become fear itself. His laughter echoed down the corridors of power, mixing with the crackle of torches and the distant hum of the city below. It was a laughter without joy, the sound of a man who had looked into the abyss of mortality and decided to become the abyss. The fever that nearly killed him had given him what he believed was revelation, that no one could touch him, no god could judge him, and no human could deny him. And from that twisted revelation, the empire's descent truly began. Because madness, when armed with absolute power, stops being madness. It becomes history. By the time winter returned to Rome, the Palatine Hill had changed. What had once been the shining center of the empire, a symbol of order, law, and divine blessing, now pulsed with dread. The corridors of marble had grown cold. The laughter that echoed through its halls no longer sounded human. The emperor who had once walked among his people now lived in near total isolation, surrounded not by friends or counselors, but by silence and trembling. Servants whispered that Caligula no longer slept, that he wandered the palace by torchlight, speaking to the statues of gods as if they were advisors. Sometimes he laughed with them. Sometimes he screamed. But when the sun rose, he was calm again, a perfect actor wearing the mask of a ruler. In those days, his obsession with control reached terrifying new heights. Every gesture, every glance, every breath in his presence became a test. He wanted to know who would hesitate, who would look away, who would flinch. The palace itself became his stage, a living laboratory of fear. He began hosting what he called banquets of loyalty. They started as lavish dinners, with gold plates, imported wines, and music played by the finest lyre players in the empire. Senators and nobles received golden invitations, trembling with both excitement and dread. To refuse was suicide, to attend was worse. At first, the evenings followed the rituals of Roman decorum. Toasts to the gods, to the emperor, to Rome. But as the night deepened, the tone shifted. Caligula would sit back, his eyes gleaming in the torchlight, watching the faces of his guests. "Tell me," he would say, smiling faintly, "how do you prove love?" No one dared to answer. He would rise slowly, moving around the table, touching the shoulders of senators, running his fingers along the golden rims of their cups. Then he would whisper something to one of them, a command, a question, a taunt, and watch as the man's face drained of color. Sometimes he demanded songs of praise. Other times, humiliations disguised as games. He forced the powerful to perform absurd tasks, dance, crawl, beg. He watched with quiet fascination as dignity dissolved before him. One senator, an elderly man named Valerius, hesitated when asked to sing. The emperor's expression froze. The room went still. Caligula tilted his head slightly, then smiled as if forgiving a child. "Perhaps you are shy, Valerius," he said softly. "Then let me help." He ordered the guards to blindfold the senator and had him spun around like a drunken fool before the crowd. The hall erupted in forced laughter, trembling hands applauding, tears mixing with wine. When Valerius finally stumbled, Caligula applauded. "Better," he said. "Much better." From that night on, the meaning of laughter in Rome changed. It no longer signaled joy. It was the sound of survival. Outside the palace, rumors spread like wildfire. Citizens spoke of the emperor's unpredictability, how he could grant riches with one breath and take lives with the next. Merchants avoided eye contact with imperial guards. Even the priests of Jupiter began to shorten their prayers, fearful that invoking the gods too loudly might draw Caligula's attention. Inside, the emperor's experiments grew darker. He began summoning the wives of senators for private audiences, calling them in the name of diplomacy or counsel. No one refused. When the women returned home, they did so in silence, their faces pale and blank. Their husbands never asked what had happened. They already knew. Over time, fear became Rome's true language. The palace guards, once symbols of loyalty, turned into the emperor's instruments of control. They moved like ghosts through the hallways, obeying orders without question. Those who hesitated vanished, their names erased, their families stripped of property. Caligula's paranoia deepened. He demanded that letters be intercepted and read aloud to him each morning. "Words are daggers," he would mutter. "Better to dull them before they cut." He began appointing spies within the Senate. Entire meetings were stage performances, senators praising laws they hadn't read, agreeing to decrees they didn't understand. They clapped, they smiled, they bowed, not to serve Rome, but to survive her emperor. And still, the palace grew darker. Caligula had new rooms constructed, private chambers with mirrored walls, so he could watch himself from every angle. "The gods see all," he told his architects. "So must I." In these chambers, he practiced his speeches, his gestures, his divinity. He rehearsed how he would appear to the people, benevolent, radiant, omnipotent. But sometimes the reflections betrayed him. He would catch sight of his own eyes and flinch, as if recognizing something monstrous staring back. Those moments of awareness were fleeting. He would recover, adjust his robe, and whisper to his reflection, "No, not monstrous. Eternal." Then came the most infamous of his creations, what the chroniclers later called the Theater of Power. It was a great hall built deep within the palace, circular and vast, designed not for art, but for submission. The emperor called it his learning chamber. In its center was a raised platform surrounded by curved tiers of marble benches. From those seats, senators and noble families were ordered to watch as lessons unfolded, lessons in obedience. Each performance was different. Sometimes, prisoners were brought in to confess imaginary crimes. Sometimes, courtiers were forced to debate which of them was more loyal, the loser sent to execution. One night, he entered the hall wearing a simple white cloak, his hair unbound. "Tonight," he announced, "we shall discuss fear." He called forward a senator's wife and asked her what she feared most. Trembling, she whispered, "Losing my husband, my lord." He smiled gently. "A noble fear." Then he turned to her husband. "And you? What do you fear most?" The man's lips trembled. "Failing you, Caesar." Then, Caligula said softly, "Let us ensure you both face your fears together." No one spoke after that. The emperor had discovered something deeper than cruelty, a form of control that didn't require whips or swords. Shame, humiliation, dread, these became his instruments. The true spectacle wasn't bloodshed. It was watching Rome's finest destroy themselves just to survive another day. Outside, the empire continued to function. Bread was baked, taxes collected, armies marched. But those who looked closely could see the rot spreading. The Senate had become a theater, the generals actors, the emperor the playwright of terror. One evening, standing on the balcony of the Palatine, Caligula looked out over the flickering lights of Rome. He turned to his advisor and said, "They say I am feared. Good. Fear is love purified." He meant it. Beneath the stars, the city glowed, proud, eternal, deceived. The people prayed for dawn, not knowing that their emperor was no longer a man at all, but a reflection of everything Rome had tried to hide from itself. The Palatine no longer belonged to the empire. It belonged to fear, and fear, once enthroned, does not easily surrender its crown. The day Caligula declared himself divine, Rome forgot how to breathe. It began, as so many of his performances did, with ceremony, incense rising in silver spirals, trumpets echoing through the marble courtyards of the Palatine Hill. The emperor appeared at dawn, dressed not in the white toga of a Roman citizen, but in golden robes that shimmered like fire in the morning light. On his head rested a crown of rays, fashioned after the image of Apollo. The message was clear. The gods were no longer above. They walked among men. He stood before the Senate and raised his hands. "For years, you have prayed to invisible deities," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Now your prayers are answered. You may look upon the divine and live." No one spoke. No one dared to. From that moment, Caligula's divinity was law. Temples across the empire were ordered to add altars in his name. Statues of Jupiter, Apollo, and Mars were melted down and reforged with his face. Priests were commanded to offer sacrifices not for him, to him. In the Forum, new coins glittered with his likeness, the inscription reading, "Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Lord and God." The transformation of the empire was swift and merciless. Where faith had once bound Rome to the heavens, now it bound her to the will of one man. The emperor's portraits hung beside the Lares, household gods, in every home. At festivals, children sang hymns to him. Even the most devout senators found themselves kneeling before marble statues of Caligula, praying not for mercy from Olympus, but from the palace. Yet even as he demanded worship, Caligula seemed haunted by his own creation. Each morning, he visited the temple he'd built for himself on the Palatine. Its walls were plated with gold, its columns inlaid with precious stones. Inside stood an enormous statue, his own image, dressed in divine armor, holding a thunderbolt. At its feet, the real Caligula knelt in silence. Some nights, the guards swore they heard him whispering to it. "Which of us is real?" he'd murmur. "You or me?" He began staging rituals that blurred the line between religion and theater. Senators and generals were summoned to witness sacred ceremonies, in which the emperor reenacted the myths of gods, Jupiter's triumphs, Apollo's visions, Dionysus's feasts. But these were not symbolic performances, they were demands for submission. At one such ritual, he dressed as Jupiter himself, lightning bolt in hand, and asked each senator to swear loyalty to the divine blood that flows through me. One senator hesitated. The emperor smiled coldly and said, "The gods punish hesitation." The man was never seen again. Outside the palace, the empire's soul began to fracture. The people's devotion turned to dread. Temples overflowed with forced offerings. Priests recited prayers with trembling voices. Some citizens whispered that the emperor had gone beyond madness, that he had declared war not just on men, but on heaven itself. Still, no one resisted. Caligula's divinity was enforced by fear, but it was also fueled by spectacle. He ordered the construction of vast public festivals to honor himself, processions of dancers, musicians, and actors portraying scenes from mythology, with one alteration. Every god was Caligula. The people watched as golden chariots rolled through the streets, carrying actors dressed as mortals kneeling before their emperor. The message was inescapable. Rome belonged not to Jupiter, not to destiny, but to Gaius. One such festival stretched for 3 days and nights. On the final evening, Caligula appeared at the top of a massive staircase, bathed in torchlight, as thousands knelt below. He raised his arms and declared, "The age of men is over. The age of God begins." Lightning cracked in the distance. Some swore it was a sign. Others whispered that he had called it himself. The emperor began incorporating his divinity into state policy. He replaced the sacred oath of office, once sworn by the gods, with a vow sworn by his own name. You will no longer serve Rome, he told his officials. You will serve eternity. Even the army, once the spine of the republic, became his choir. Soldiers were required to chant his name during drills. Legion's standards carried not only the eagle, but his likeness. A man who refused to kneel before the imperial effigy was executed for blasphemy. But the more Caligula claimed to be a god, the more fragile he became. He feared shadows in the corridors, convinced that Jupiter envied him, that Neptune conspired against him, that the gods plotted revenge. He ordered sacrifices to appease them, hundreds of oxen, bulls, even exotic animals imported from Egypt. The blood flowed through the streets of Rome, staining marble red. One night, he stood before the statue of Jupiter in the Capitol, staring into its stone eyes. "Do you tremble, old god?" he whispered. "You should." Then he ordered his artisans to remove the statue's head and replace it with his own. Even his advisors began to sense the unraveling. His speeches became erratic, his laughter unpredictable. He'd begin a conversation about law or taxes, only to drift into ramblings about immortality and the afterlife. "Death," he said once during a banquet, "is for mortals. I will never die. My blood has burned it away." He tested that belief daily, daring fate to challenge him. He walked barefoot through storms, shouting at the thunder. He slept beside roaring fires, claiming the flames could not harm him. Once, during a Senate meeting, he drew a dagger and held it against his own chest. "If I were mortal," he said with a grin, "this would kill me." Then he laughed, dropped the blade, and walked away. Rome watched in horror, yet there was brilliance in his madness. Every act of blasphemy reinforced his control. The Senate, the generals, the priests, all were trapped by the same logic. To deny his divinity was to commit treason, and to obey it was to betray the gods. It was the perfect prison. Over time, even the distinction between sacred and profane disappeared. Religious festivals became orgiastic feasts of excess. Rituals meant to honor life turned into parodies of power. The emperor demanded that senators' wives serve as priestesses in his ceremonies, symbols of purity forced into spectacle. He called it worship. Others called it humiliation. Still, Rome played along. Because in the empire of a god, disobedience was heresy, and heresy was death. But even gods bleed. Late one night, a storm swept across the city. Lightning slashed the sky above the Palatine, and the emperor stood again before his golden statue. "Do you see?" he shouted into the thunder. "I am you now." The statue glowed under each flash of lightning, its eyes seeming to come alive. For a moment, Caligula's laughter filled the temple. Then a thunderclap shook the ground so violently that the statue cracked from crown to chest. The next morning, the emperor ordered it repaired. But something in him shifted. His laughter grew sharper, his commands crueler. It was as if he'd taken the statue's fracture as proof that even the heavens could not contain him. The emperor who once believed himself immortal had crossed a final line, one that no man, mortal or divine, could walk back from. He had conquered the gods. Now only men were left to destroy. By the dawn of 41 CE, Rome had become a city that worshipped with trembling hands. The golden temples that once honored Jupiter and Mars now bore the image of one man, Caligula, the living god who walked among mortals. His statue stood in every forum, every temple, every corner of the empire, gleaming under the sun like an accusation. The Senate obeyed his decrees without question, and the people whispered prayers for his favor as if their lives depended on the whim of his madness. But the empire was breaking. The treasury, once overflowing from conquest, had been drained by the emperor's extravagance. Every festival, every monument, every act of divine spectacle bled Rome dry. Senators were taxed into ruin, their estates seized under the pretense of divine debt. The common people starved while the emperor showered his favorites with gold and jewels. And in the shadow of his divinity, fear began to curdle into hatred. Caligula's delusions had grown uncontrollable. He no longer merely claimed godhood, he demanded proof of it. He ordered priests to announce new miracles daily, the sun shining longer because of his will, the rain falling where he commanded, the tides obeying his voice. When the natural world refused to cooperate, he punished it. He once stood on the shore of the Bay of Naples, staring at the waves, and shouted, "I command you to obey your emperor." When the sea answered only with silence, he ordered his soldiers to charge into the surf with swords drawn. "Collect the spoils of victory," he bellowed. The legionnaires hesitated, but none dared disobey. They marched waist-deep into the waves, returning with their helmets full of seashells. Caligula called them tribute from Neptune and displayed them in the temple as trophies of conquest. Even his inner circle began to fracture. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal to the death, now served in a state of quiet dread. Its commander, Cassius Chaerea, an older soldier and decorated officer, had become a frequent target of the emperor's cruel jokes. Caligula mocked his age, his voice, even his masculinity. "Speak up, Chaerea," he'd sneered during court ceremonies. "The gods can't hear you from Olympus." Each insult drove the commander deeper into silence, and that silence began to take shape, not as submission, but as resolve. Inside the palace, Caligula's world drifted further into nightmare. He had turned the imperial residence into a temple of himself, filled with altars and offerings. Servants moved through the halls barefoot and whispering, for fear of offending their living god. He dined alone more often now, surrounded by mirrors and gold. Sometimes, in the middle of a meal, he would begin speaking to his reflection as though it were an equal. "You are the only one who understands," he would whisper, raising a cup of wine to himself. His wife Caesonia, one of the few who dared to speak freely, begged him to rest, to slow down, to remember he was still human. He laughed in her face. "Human," he said softly. "No, my love. Humanity is a cage I have already outgrown." Outside, storms battered the city. Lightning scorched the temples, floods swept through the lower districts, and famine struck the countryside. The people whispered that the gods had turned against their emperor. Caligula responded by demanding greater sacrifices. Hundreds of oxen were slaughtered. When the omens continued, he turned to more desperate offerings: prisoners, slaves, even citizens accused of blasphemy. Rome began to reek of blood and incense. At the same time, his paranoia deepened. He ordered the execution of several senators for plotting against the divine will. The charges were absurd. Some had merely coughed during his speeches, others had failed to appear sufficiently awed during his proclamations. Their deaths served a single purpose: to remind Rome that the emperor's madness was absolute. But even absolute power has its limits. In January of 41 CE, Caligula announced a grand celebration, a festival to honor his own immortality. "The gods envy me," he declared to the Senate, "but the people shall see that I am greater than envy." The event was to last 3 days, culminating in a lavish theatrical performance staged in the underground passageways of the Palatine. It was here, in the depths of the very palace that had become his temple, that fate finally turned. On the morning of the 3rd day, the corridors buzzed with activity. Musicians tuned their instruments. Servants carried trays of silver and gold. Senators rehearsed speeches of flattery. The emperor, radiant in a robe woven with gold thread, entered the hall laughing, followed by Caesonia and a small entourage. He was in high spirits, bragging that even the stars would bow before him tonight. As the ceremony began, the emperor moved through a narrow passage lined with torches, the air heavy with smoke and perfume. At his side walked Cassius Chaerea. "Will the gods attend us tonight, my lord?" Chaerea asked quietly. Caligula smirked. "They are already here," he said. "You are looking at one." Those were his last words. In a flash of steel, the first blade struck. Then another. The torches flickered wildly as chaos erupted in the corridor. The Praetorian commander's dagger plunged into the emperor's chest, followed by the swords of several conspirators. Caligula screamed, not in fear, but in disbelief. The god had been reminded he could bleed. He staggered backward, blood blooming across his golden robe. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for recognition, for loyalty, for mercy. None came. One final strike severed the illusion. The living god was dead. When the news reached the city, disbelief swept through Rome like wildfire. Some wept in shock, others cheered openly in the streets. The Senate convened in emergency session, unsure whether to celebrate or to fear what might come next. The conspirators found Caesonia and their infant daughter soon after. Both were killed, not out of vengeance, but out of fear that divine madness might be hereditary. The palace was sealed. When the new Emperor Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was declared ruler days later, his first act was to erase the evidence. The temples were cleansed, the statues destroyed, the inscriptions of divinity melted down and recast into images of the old gods. The corridors where Caligula had ruled were scrubbed clean, the marble polished until no trace of blood remained. But the scars were deeper than stone. In private, Rome never forgot. Families who had bowed before him carried the shame for generations. The senators who had survived the feasts of humiliation now ruled in whispers, afraid of what memory itself might resurrect. The soldiers who had once marched into the sea under his orders still dreamed of the waves, endless, mocking, whispering his name. The Palatine Hill remained quiet for months. Then, slowly, life returned. Birds nested in the eaves. Grass grew between the stones. Tourists and scholars centuries later would walk those same corridors, marveling at the grandeur of empire, never realizing they were stepping over the ghosts of those who had trembled there. History remembered Caligula as a monster, a madman who turned power into a mirror for his own delusions. But beneath that madness was something far more human, a boy who had learned that love was dangerous, that survival meant dominance, and that fear was the only truth that never betrayed him. In the end, his reign lasted just under 4 years. 4 years that reshaped the meaning of power in Rome, that turned divinity into terror and worship into obedience. The God who believed he could not die had fallen, not by the hand of a rival, but by the hand of those who had once called him Lord. And as the sun rose over Rome that morning, its light caught on the marble of the Palatine Hill, revealing the faintest streaks of red where the stone had not yet been fully cleaned. The empire endured, but the memory of Caligula's laughter, bright, unending, and hollow, would echo through its halls for centuries. The morning after Caligula's death, Rome was silent. Not the silence of mourning, but the kind that comes after a storm. The world holding its breath, unsure whether it's truly over. Smoke still rose from the Palatine Hill. The torches from last night's feast burned down to embers. The marble floors of the imperial corridors had been scrubbed clean, but blood clings to stone in ways water cannot wash away. The emperor's body was gone, taken by his killers, burned, buried, hidden. Yet his presence lingered, heavy and suffocating, like incense that refuses to fade. No one spoke his name aloud that day. The senators met in secret, behind locked doors, debating whether to rejoice or pray for forgiveness. Some argued for the restoration of the Republic. Others, too afraid of chaos, begged for another emperor. The people of Rome watched and waited. They had learned that power never truly dies. It simply changes hands. When Claudius, the timid uncle whom Caligula had mocked as a fool, was proclaimed emperor, it felt less like a victory than a confession. Rome could not live without a master. But the real question wasn't who would rule. It was what remained of those who had survived him. The senators who once bowed at Caligula's banquets now carried invisible scars. The wives who had been summoned to the palace walked with hollow eyes. The soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, who had struck him down, could not meet one another's gaze without remembering the sound, the scream that had ended an empire's illusion of divinity. For days, rumors spread through the streets like restless ghosts. Some said Caligula had survived, that a god could not be killed by mortal blades. Others swore that his spirit haunted the palace at night, wandering the corridors where his statue still stood cracked but unfallen. And perhaps, in a way, he had survived. The empire moved on, but something within it had shifted forever. Rome's people had seen what happens when power divorces itself from reason, when a man becomes an idea too large for flesh to contain. They had seen fear dressed as faith, cruelty disguised as ceremony, madness worshipped as divine order. They didn't yet have the words for it, but what Caligula left behind was not just ruin. It was a warning. The palace that once glowed like heaven now felt like a tomb. Servants whispered of cold drafts and footsteps that echoed when no one walked. At night, the flickering lamps seemed to cast shadows shaped like a man's silhouette, arms outstretched, as if giving a benediction or demanding applause. The new emperor ordered the walls repainted, the statues destroyed, the altars dismantled. Yet every hammer blow seemed to awaken something deeper. When the workers tore down Caligula's golden temple, they found beneath it hidden chambers, rooms lined with mirrors, floors stained dark where incense and blood had mixed. In one, a cracked bronze mask stared up from the dust, half smiling, half screaming. The workers fled. The palace was sealed again. Years turned into decades. Rome prospered under Claudius, then Nero, then others who would rise and fall in their turn. But Caligula's name lingered like a curse, spoken only in whispers, a reminder of the thin line between divine ambition and human insanity. Historians wrote of him as a monster, poets as a warning, philosophers as proof that unchecked power corrupts not just the state but the soul. And yet, some refused to condemn him outright. He was a mirror, one writer said, a reflection of Rome itself. He did not invent the darkness, he only gave it a crown. Centuries later, travelers would climb the Palatine Hill, walking through the ruins where emperors once ruled the world. They would marvel at the grandeur, the arches, the mosaics, the remnants of marble once polished to a mirror shine. But beneath their feet, buried in dust and time, lay the memory of a man who had once believed himself a god. Archaeologists would one day uncover fragments of his reign, coins bearing his radiant face, inscriptions proclaiming him divine, and the remains of a statue whose eyes had been gouged out by trembling hands. They would call him cruel, insane, decadent. And yet, the question that haunted them was the same one whispered by those who lived through his rule. Was Caligula born mad, or did the empire drive him to madness? Because perhaps the tragedy of Caligula was not that he thought himself a god, but that Rome wanted him to be one. They built him temples, gave him titles, fell to their knees, and called it loyalty. In the end, they created what they feared most. Every empire repeats this pattern. A ruler rises, promising renewal. The people cheer, desperate to believe. Then power grows, twisting from leadership into obsession, until one man's will outweighs the law itself. Rome learned it first, but not last. When you walk through the ruins today, you can still feel it, the echo of that cycle. The marble columns, broken and sun-bleached, seem almost to whisper as the wind passes through them. Not words, but a rhythm, rise and fall, rise and fall. And in the great hall of the Palatine, where Caligula once held his feasts of terror, the light filters in through the shattered roof. Dust drifts through the air like ghosts. If you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it. The faint ring of laughter, distant, hollow, eternal. The tourists who visit shrug it off. Just the wind, they say. Just the past. But history never really stays buried. The stones remember. They remember the child in his miniature armor, marching beside his father's legions. They remember the young emperor hailed as a savior, his smile bright enough to blind a city desperate for hope. They remember the fever, the crown, the madness. And they remember the knife that ended it all. For Rome, Caligula was both a nightmare and a mirror, a story too dark to forget, too true to ignore. His reign lasted only 4 years, but it changed the way power was seen forever. He showed that the line between emperor and god, ruler and tyrant, savior and destroyer, is drawn not by divinity, but by the eyes of those who believe. The empire he left behind continued to grow, conquer, and shape the world. But deep within its triumphs lay the ghost of a single truth: the greater the power, the thinner the veil between worship and fear. And so the story ends where it began, in silence. The torches are gone. The gold has faded. The gods are dust. Only the stones remain, whispering their warning across centuries. Beware the man who believes himself divine, for in him, the empire sees its own reflection.